Welcome. My name is Louisa Wood-Ruby. I am head of research at the Frick Art Reference Library, and it is my pleasure today to welcome all of you to the second of our four-part series, Collecting Impressions, 6 Centuries of Print Connoisseurship. The first one was last week, October 7th, with Anthony Griffiths. Today we have Dr. Karen Bowen, whom you see on your screen. We will have 2 more, part 3 and part 4, in the next 2 Wednesdays at 12 noon. So please sign up for those if you haven't done so already. The series was co-organized by the Frick Center for the History of Collecting in conjunction with the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Department of Drawings and Prints, and is supported by the IFPDA Foundation, and it's part of the IFPDA Print Month this October. I'd like now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Karen L. Bowen. Dr. Bowen is a specialist in the printmaking and book illustration early modern period. Her research has focused particularly on the production of illustrated editions at the Plantin Moretus Press and the activities of artists engaged by that press, including the Wierixes and the extended Gala family. Her current projects include studies of the life and career of Charles de Malory and the activities of the Sadlers as booksellers, as well as research for a book entitled The Flourishing International Trade in Prints from Antwerp, a study of print prices and distribution networks among leading European print sellers and booksellers from about 1560 to 1640. Her past publications include Christopher Plantin and engraved book illustrations in 16th century Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in 2008, co-written with Dirk Imhoff, which was awarded the Roland H. Banton Book Prize in Art History. The article Print Prices in Antwerp, Rubens and His Contemporaries was published in Print Quarterly in 2017, and a study of the production and distribution of Jerome Nadal's Evangelicae, Historiae, Imagines, and Adnotationes and Meditationes in Evangelica was published in the library in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bowen.
Thank you, Louisa, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone attending. I'd like to thank the Frick Collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the IFPDA Print Foundation for organizing and sponsoring this symposium and inviting me to participate. Today, I will discuss the part played by booksellers in the international distribution of renowned prints from Antwerp during the first half of the 17th century. I will demonstrate how the managers of the Plantin Moretus Press helped print publishers with the transport of and receipt of payment for their wares, in addition to assisting an international array of booksellers with purchases of prints that they could sell in turn to their own clients. Following a brief introduction to the Plantin Moretus Press and the artists concerned, I will provide a sampling of the range of places to which the Moretuses sent prints. I will then relate how this system of distribution worked, from how prints were ordered to the settlement of the associated costs. This will reveal the importance of diverse networks and trade routes for the dissemination of tens of thousands of prints throughout Europe. The Plantin Moretus Press was established in Antwerp by the Frenchman Christopher Plantin around 1555, when Antwerp was an important city for the trade in luxury goods and home to numerous internationally successful printmakers and print publishers. Plantin's business grew to be one of the largest in Europe and continued to thrive under his immediate successors, his son-in-law Jan Moretus I, followed by his sons Jan II and Balthasar I, and then Jan II's son, Balthasar II. Throughout, Antwerp continued to boast a burgeoning print production for the international market. The most important figures in this world whom I will be discussing today include Philip Schelle, there's a print of his on the right, who, together with Hieronymus Koch and Gerard Diode, were among the leading print publishers in 16th century Antwerp. Philip Schelle's son, Theodor Schelle, image of his on the left, continued his father's print publishing business. I'll also be mentioning Philip Schala's sons-in-law, Charles de Malery and Adrien Collard, both of whom were successful independent printmakers and publishers. Finally, I'll also be mentioning Peter de Jode, an image of his on the right, who was the son of Philip Schala's contemporary, Gerard de Jode, as well as Michiel Snijders, who was known for small, finely engraved and illuminated images. It is important to recall that of all the images that I've shown you, Philip Schala's circular engraving would have filled a single sheet of paper, but that all the rest of the images were smaller, such that they would fit just on the palm of your hand. How extensive was the Moretus' distribution of prints? Let me start with a few examples from Italy. The Moretuses sent unspecified packages of images, along with orders of books, to, for example, Justus Sadler in Venice. This son of the engraver Jan Sadler I was a print publisher and a bookseller. Here you can see he received works from Theodor Galle, Charles de Malery, Adrien Collard, and Peter de Jode. The Moretuses also sold prints directly to individual booksellers. For example, in 1608, Giovanni Paolo Gelli in Rome bought hundreds of books in an order that was shipped and paid for via merchants. This order included almost 5,000 prints from several leading print publishers. In particular, Philip Schale, his sons Theodor and Cornelius Schale, his sons-in-law Adrien Collard, Charles de Malery, and Peter de Jode. I'll return to the issue of the relative price of prints later on. As you can see from the list of what Theodor Galle supplied for Gelli in this order, you can see that this included both 426 diverse, unspecified single sheets, as well as several specific print series, including, for example, this engraving by Cornelius Cort after Martin van Heemskerk, which had first been published in 1564 by Hieronymus Koch, and was thus resold by Theodor Galle some 40 years later. Gelli was clearly planning for a range of markets and different types of collectors. Such records as these document that hundreds to thousands of prints by various important Antwerp print sellers were making their way to distinct Italian cities via booksellers, either as unspecified packages included within the Moretus' regular shipments of books, or as images the Moretuses purchased on behalf of foreign booksellers and sent them. Both forms of participation in the international print trade recur regularly with booksellers elsewhere. Print sales to Spain are scarcer, perhaps due to the lack of a reliable context for shipping. Nevertheless, in 1623, Jan Moretus II engaged his brother-in-law, the merchant Nicolas de Swert, to arrange for the transport to Seville of hundreds of books in several barrels to two booksellers there, where, among the final extra items noted for Antonio de Toro, were 3,200 prints by Charles de Malery, in addition to 4 sets of de Malery's series of images of individuals associated with the Franciscan orders. And I'm showing you the title page of that series here. There are also notably few print sales to England via the Moretuses, despite important contact with such booksellers as Ascanius de Renealma and John Norton, who were interested primarily in books and maps. However, there's one very interesting exception, namely John Woutnail, who sent money to Jan Moretus I via artists between 1587 and 1603. Thus, the Moretuses were not the primary intermediaries for the exchange of prints, but their financial transactions with Woutnail confirm his own independent contact with several Antwerp print publishers. In the example I'm showing you here, you can see the names of Jan Baptist Frins, the widow and son of Gerard de Jode, and Adriaan Collaert. In other records, for example, Philip Schelle is also mentioned. I will discuss the sale of prints after Rubens to the London bookseller Humphrey Robinson in 1640 later on. In France, there are numerous examples of Parisian-based booksellers who assisted with the transfer of packages sent by Antwerp artists via the Moretises to the artist's own clients in Paris. In 1617, for example, Charles de Malery and Peter de Jode sent packages to the Parisian print dealer Jean Messager via the Sonius family. Also, reminiscent to the case of John Woutenail in London, some Antwerp print sellers maintained their own independent contact with booksellers in France. This is evident, for example, from transactions between the Moretises and the bookseller Jean Dupuy in Lille and Adriaan Collaert. In the slide that I'm showing you now, you can see that Adriaan Collaert was evidently responsible for getting the books that Jean Dupuy had ordered from the Moretises to him. Whether Collaert traveled to Lille or whether Jean Dupuy visited Collaert is unclear. Similarly, the Moretises, in other records, sent packages to Dupuy for Collaert. And also, Collaert would give money to the Moretises for Dupuy, and the Moretises also paid Collaert money in Dupuy's name. It is important to note that the contact between the booksellers began simultaneously with arrangements via the artists, which underscores the importance of the trade in prints from the start of the contact between the Moretises and, in this case, Jean Dupuy in Lille. Not surprising, within the southern Netherlands, there were far more smaller print shipments recorded. For example, between 1592 and 98, Joos van der Straten en Courtrai ordered 1 to 2 quires of 25 pages each of mostly plain but occasionally colored prints from Adriaan Huberti of Huybrechts, a few times each year. In this example from 1594, he ordered 1 boek or a quire of small images printed 8 to a page, which amounted to 200 illustrations for 18 stuivers. He also ordered 1 quire of larger images printed 4 to a page, amounting to 100 illustrations for the same price of 18 stuivers. Thus, the price was based on the number of pages sent, 25 in these examples, and not the number of individual prints purchased. There are even occasional sales of prints to booksellers in the northern Netherlands, despite the active local print production there. For example, Hendrik Barendsen in Amsterdam was a Catholic with long-standing good personal contact with Balthasar I and II. He occasionally bought prints and other religious items from the Moretises. For example, around 1630, he purchased richly decorated pages with the canon of the Mass, image on the left, a slightly later example, I'll admit, but they're hard to come by, and images of saints with prayers, otherwise called suffragien, image on the right. He was also sent numerous unspecified packages from Michael Snijders. But Barendsen also played another important role in the international distribution of prints. Namely, he assisted with large shipments of books and prints that were destined for Gdansk or Danzig in these records. Initially, the print trade between Antwerp and Danzig was dominated by transactions arranged by the de Jode family of print publishers. In the 1630s to 40s, the print trade between Antwerp and Danzig via the Moretises featured the booksellers Caspar and Georg Forster, who were well connected with the Polish court. For example, in 1637, Caspar Forster purchased hundreds of liturgical editions and numerous other books, as well as 1,000 illuminated images on parchment, 600 plain prints on parchment, and 1,000 plain prints on paper, all of which were shipped to him via Barensen in Amsterdam. Despite such impressive large orders, the Moretises assisted the most with print sales to Germany. Although one might naturally think of the Frankfurt fairs, there is actually a striking lack of print sales there by the Moretises themselves. Rather, this appears to have been more often the place for the exchange between individual print publishers and their own network of clients. For example, in 1614, Charles de Malery engaged the Moretises to send packages of prints to the Frankfurt Fair for approval by a certain Nicholas Bonte. Once in Frankfurt, Bonte paid for the prints that he wanted and the shipping costs, and returned the rest via the Moretises. Once back in Antwerp, some 2 months later, de Malery received his money from the Moretises, but also had to pay for the transport costs of the return of the prints that Bonte did not want. This thus would have represented an extra cost for him. And as you've observed, paying for shipping was not as we do it today, namely the person who received the item had to pay the shipping costs, not the person who sent it. Evidence of the Cologne print dealer Peter Overaert's payments for de Malery made to the Moretises at the Frankfurt fairs indicate that de Malery probably supplied him with as many as 5,800 prints per year for several years running during the first quarter of the 17th century. This amounted to a total of as many as 58,000 prints, and we're talking about exchanges between one print seller and one print dealer. And you have to remember there are hundreds of print sellers and print dealers attending each of the biannual Frankfurt fairs in the 16th to early 17th century. There's clearly an immense trade going on there that I believe is grossly underestimated today. To return to the Moretises, the most important destination in Germany for prints ordered and shipped via the Moretises was in fact Cologne. This was along the established trade route to Frankfurt and home to several artist refugees from the Low Countries, such as the Hogenberg family and Crispin de Passe for a time. In addition to many local individuals who dealt in prints, such as Peter Overaert, whom I just mentioned, and numerous booksellers who were also trading in prints. Altogether, they would have supported an active, large, independent trade in prints and maps where images from the Netherlands were common. Consider, for example, the 1611 sale to Anton Heraut I, an independent printer-publisher in Cologne, who bought numerous books, as well as several print series from Theodor Galle, including the Life of St. Ignatius, the item highlighted at the top in the lower left detail, 600 prints and 2 print series from Charles de Malery, the item highlighted in the middle, and nearly 400 prints from Hieronymus Wierix, highlighted below. If we compare this order with what Heraut purchased some 15 to 17 years later, for example, in 1627, you can see another huge order for books, which now included 6,300 prints from Theodor Galle alone, where the range of prices that you see detailed in the lower left reflects the difference in support, paper versus parchment, and the quality of the finishing. Some, for example, were gilded. In 1629, Heraut purchased many more books, as well as several canons from both Michael Snijders and Theodor Galle, which are, as you can see, represented here in various price classes, which are a function of the number of pages involved, whether they were printed on plain white paper or illuminated or gilded. Heraut's purchases document the increased diversification of prints that were available by 1630, in terms of finishing and price classes, and reflect the expansion of the print market in Antwerp, where 2 decades following a preference, for example, for fine prints on paper by Hieronymus Wierix, there is now an increase in importance placed on the outward effect, the costly finishing of the image. Thus far, I have presented examples of the range of the Moretus' involvement in the international distribution of prints. I'd now like to review and summarize these various examples and outline how this actually worked in practice. In particular, how were orders for prints placed? The approach used reflects the bookseller's relationship with the print seller. For example, orders could be placed directly with artists, whereby the Moretuses helped ship and package the prints and occasionally transferred money for them. This was not uncommon and documents the extent to which the networks of print publishers included booksellers. Simultaneously, booksellers in such diverse cities as Rome, Paris, and Cologne also served as the local pickup point for packages sent by Antwerp print publishers to their own personal clients. This underscores once again the importance of networks and that diverse networks were working simultaneously in conjunction with one another to facilitate the distribution of prints throughout Europe. Orders for prints could also be placed along with books directly with the Moretuses, and this was usually done by letter. Indeed, by the 17th century, booksellers often needed to buy prints in advance via the Moretuses, as is explained in a letter Balthasar Moretus II wrote to Bernard Rosvelt in Münster in 1643, when he clarified artist views regarding payments. Specifically, if a client was not an acquaintance of theirs or otherwise known to them, payments had to be made in cash in advance. No prints were to be sent on approval, such as de Malory had done in Frankfurt a few decades earlier. Thus, for the artists, there would be no delay in the receipt of their money, no risk of a lost shipment, and no extra fees for the return of unwanted prints. This underscores once again the importance of personal networks and contacts for these transactions. When booksellers placed requests for books, Moretuses, they were occasionally vaguely formulated. For example, in 1644, Georg Forster in Danzig asked for prints from the widow of Johannes Huberti if she had something new. Or, in 1615, Johann Kruger of Augsburg was sent just an assortment of 1,000 images from de Malory. The Moretuses might make suggestions in return. For example, in 1631, Balthasar I, perhaps not truly impartial, advised Bernard Rosvelt in Münster that prints on parchment by Theodor Halle, his nephew, were superior to those offered by Jan Knobart. Or, in 1643, Balthasar II sent Bernard Rosvelt samples of 12 different prints from 2 different print publishers that were identified by number, which you can see in the detail at the bottom of the screen, with the details of the price and the publisher from which Rosvelt could choose. Other records indicate how detailed an order might have been in terms of the identification of the artist and the subject. When the London bookseller Humphrey Robinson purchased prints after Rubens in 1640, you can see in the detail on the left that the name of the artist, Rubens, is mentioned at the top of the order, and the subjects of the prints are listed below, including, as this detail here shows you, the start of the caption beneath the print. It was possible thus to identify exactly which rendition of this subject after Rubens was being sent. Such detail is unusual, however. Generally, the most important specifications when ordering prints via the Maretises was the supplier, a matter of taste and the type of print one sought, the support, paper versus parchment, and whether or not it was to be colored or decorated, which also naturally affected the price and also gives some indication of the market the individual buyer wanted to serve. Those who actually designed the prints and made them are noted far less often. A good example of this is the instructions sent in 1644 by Georg Forster of Danzig, and they provide a rare view of how specific the order might be. Here you can see that it gives a list arranged according to supplier, which included Constantia van Merlen at the top, Alexander Voet below, and in some cases the name of the shop and where it was located, such as the Black Eagle on the Mer in the middle. Forster also specified the quantity that he wanted, 15, 30, 40, hundreds, and elsewhere thousands of prints, the relative size of the images, whether they were to be printed on paper or parchment, and the type of finishing he wanted, not only whether they were to be colored, but also additional forms of embellishment were specified. His remarks indicate that he had been in Antwerp himself and made such purchases personally. Moreover, he also asked the Maretises to buy 10 to 15 individual prints, colored in the usual manner and artistically made on parchment, from, notably, no one in particular, so he specified the supplier for all the previous images in bulk, but these images did not have to come from anyone in particular, as long as they appeared attractive and fit within his price range. They were, notably, for two different collectors, his patron and someone else. Thus, Forster was ordering not only for two specific collectors, but also prints in bulk for his own personal range of clients. Finally, Forster also specifies which prints he does not want, namely ones with profane subjects, nor ones with captions in Dutch, nor images with Spanish or French monks or nuns who are not revered in Danzig. Thus, he was not willing to take a general sample of images such as de Malery sent Johann Kruger in Augsburg a few decades before. Forster's orders provide a telling contrast with those placed by Jos van der Straten some 50 years earlier, when it was not uncommon to buy prints in bulk by quires of just 25 sheets, and that the base price of ordinary prints was calculated by the number of standard sheets of paper sent, regardless of the number of prints, 1, 4, or 8, for example, that were printed per page. In van der Straten's orders, the total quantity purchased was more often in the range of 25 to 200 images, versus the hundreds to thousands bought decades later by Forster. Thus, by the mid-17th century, the print offerings in Antwerp had clearly expanded immensely, both in terms of the quantity of images available and the variety of finishings, where special images were bought by piece and prints in bulk were bought by the hundreds to thousands. Naturally, once you determined which prints you wanted, these had to be paid for. One could arrange to do this directly with artists, as presumably was the case with John Woutmail and Jean Dupuy, for example, who occasionally had artists help pay their debts with the Maretises. But the reverse arrangements were more common in the Maretises' accounts, whereby they received money from booksellers for artists. This was occasionally done via the Frankfurt fairs, as I've already discussed in the case of de Malery. More often, the booksellers simply put money on his account with the Maretises and then asked them to pay off their debts, as Jean Dupuy did for Adrian Collard. The Maretises also regularly purchased prints from artists directly and resold them to booksellers. This was the point of Forster's instructions discussed above, and we've seen many examples already. Yet, what I have not yet discussed is the extent to which the Moradises profited from these transactions themselves. Let us compare the prices they charged for unspecified prints in bulk supplied by Charles de Malery. In 1623, the Moradises charged 75 stivers per 100 prints in a sale to Antonio de Toro in Seville. In 1611, they charged 60 stivers per 100 prints in a sale to Anton Girard in Cologne. In 1608, they charged 50 stivers per 100 prints in a sale to Giovanni Paolo Gelli in Rome. This last rate was the standard one at which de Malery supplied his prints to the Moradises for resale, and that was the case for each of the examples listed here. Thus, the Moradises' profit ranged from 0 with Gelli to 800 stivers or 40 florins with de Toro. To put this in some sort of perspective, let us consider the range of print prices offered to Gelli in 1608. Those are listed on the left, and compare them with the wages paid to an assistant mason working in Antwerp at the time, in the middle, or the prices that the Moradises charged for small books of hours with woodcut illustrations on the right. De Malery's price of 50 stivers per 100 prints, or 0.5 stivers per print, as you can see, lay in the middle of the offerings of other publishers, with Adriaan Collard and Theodor Galla represented at the low end, the 0.2 and 0.36 stivers per print, and Philip Galla and Peter de Jode at the high end, with the 1 stiver and 2 stiver rate. In all cases, an assistant mason in Antwerp could have bought a number of these prints, in theory, with 1 summer day's wage, and the Moradises' 800 stiver profit on the resale of prints to de Toro would have been the equivalent of 100 copies of a small book of hours with woodcuts, which is not bad. Generally, the amount of profit the Moradises added was irregular, both in terms of when it was done and the extra amount charged. The inclusion of a profit margin cannot be linked directly with specific artists. Rather, it is more likely associated with specific clients and occurred in particular with distant individuals placing exceptional orders, such as de Toro in Seville, versus their regular clients, the local booksellers, friends, or family. Indeed, despite the examples with which I began, usually no profit margin was added on the resale of prints to fellow booksellers. Consider, for example, the resale of 2 quires of ordinary prints from Adriaan Huberti in 1593 at cost, or the resale of 120 images of saints with prayers from Hendrik Artsens in 1626, also at cost, or the resale of 1,100 prints, including colored images on parchment from Theodor Galla to Bernard Rosveld of Münster in 1630, once again at cost. I could show you many more examples that confirm that the pattern was generally resale of prints to booksellers was done at cost. The situation was different with sales to private individuals, such as nobles and merchants, and when in those cases the Moradises would add some profit irregularly, more often. To conclude, what do these examples reveal about the involvement of booksellers in the trade of prints from Antwerp? First of all, the importance of networks, personal ones, knowing the artists and the print dealers, and professional ones among booksellers and between artists and booksellers. Also, the importance of trade routes, locally within Low Countries, but also to France, and in particular to Cologne and the Frankfurt fairs, and to Danzig via Amsterdam, as an important gateway for the further distribution of images to Eastern Europe. And when the established trade routes were lacking, there was a common reliance on merchants for transport, for example, to Italy or to Spain. I've also discussed various options for arranging for the payment for prints, either via acquaintances and family or merchants, or through the regular debit-credit accounts with the Maretises. We've also seen how the production of prints in Antwerp clearly expanded to meet the increase in demand, both in terms of the quantity and the variety of prints for sale. It is important to recall that all the buyers I've discussed today were, in the first place, booksellers. Their print purchases via the Maretises and their subsequent distribution and resale of them to others was not their primary business, but a sideline, engaged in by some annually, others occasionally, and others just rarely, perhaps upon the specific request of a local collector. It is also important to recall that the Maretises were not the only option for the acquisition and transport of prints, and that other booksellers and numerous print publishers and art dealers would have been doing the same thing simultaneously, occasionally relying on others, such as independent merchants, as intermediaries. But these observations do not diminish the significance of these accounts, rather they underscore it. For these records provide exceptional, concrete, rare evidence of how these transactions took place among sundry book and print sellers throughout Europe. They also reveal the often ignored overlap between their businesses that facilitated an extensive and immense trade in a variety of prints. If nothing else, these records from the Maretises document how immense and widespread this trade was. This reflects in turn the broad range of interests of diverse collectors in this period, who bought assorted special objects, including books and prints. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for that fascinating talk on international print trade in Europe in the 17th century. It's really incredible, all the work and all the research that you've done. I think we're probably all amazed by that and have lots of nice questions for you in the chat box. The first one I have here from Jeffrey Muller. Are there any terms that you found that specifying your impressions?
I'm sorry,
the
could
prints.
you repeat the question?
Sorry, I think my video might have frozen. Have you seen any terms that specifies a needed quality of impressions or size of margins or, age of...
Right. Well, as Anthony Griffiths cited in his talk last week, there is a very famous correspondence between Christopher Plantin and individuals in Italy who are looking for prints after Dürer, in which Plantin remarks that the price that you will pay depends upon the quality of the impression. But as I would be quick to note, that's obviously a very valuable, reliable remark. Such remarks, though, are very rare, and that what the Maretises were dealing in primarily were prints in bulk, but also a mix of, as we saw with the Order to Gelli, both older images, 40 years old from Hieronymus Koch, as well as the contemporary prints, the hot off the press, what is Philip Scala produced by 1580 and send me 4 copies of each. But there are no references to margins or quality of impressions generally, I would say, except for the letter that Anthony mentioned last week from Plantin.
Okay, I just want to say that please put your questions in the Q&A box because that's where I'll see them. I think Maybe someone raised their hand. I'll try and look at that later. There's a couple questions about, do you know of other research on other countries, print sellers in other countries, and trade, so from Paris to other places or Italy, are there other people working on that? And similarly, sort of reverse question, I guess, is there evidence for trade with the New World? Those are two questions.
Okay, so for evidence of trade with the New World, I'm afraid I can't help you directly. We could trace, as I said, a few orders of prints going to Italy and to Spain, where primarily I think the prints then would have been gathered in Spain and then sent on to the New World. Okay. They do not go directly from the Mauritiuses to that far destination. So you would have to look in archives in Salamanca, for example, or Madrid to hopefully answer that question. For other studies of work of print sellers, again, Anthony focused on examples from the later 17th and 18th century. You obviously also have Gravel's work from 1986 about people who are active in the print trade in Paris in the 17th century. But there, again, she has done a great deal of work, and there are numerous archival records for, let's say, purchasing houses and legal transactions, but not nearly the resources, and that's what's really lacking, of actual print sale transactions. And that's what makes the Mauritius records so exceptional, because you know, for once, what a print seller is charging for his works while he's alive, not in an estate inventory, not a later auction, but actually while he's alive, or she in later cases, and what they are charging for their prints.
Okie dokie. Let's see here. Are there any trends in the importance of authorship in the market? I guess wanting to make sure that the print was by somebody. Is there any trend that appears over the course of the time?
Well, I would say from the records that I've seen that you have in the beginning, in the earlier stages in period of Plantin, 1570s to 1580s, there are, I think, more records where the specific image is really noted by title with occasional references to a designer or an engraver. As we progress in the 17th century, those references become less frequent, and the print sales are more in bulk, where just the supplier is more important versus the designer and engraver. Now, one very important exception to that are prints after Rubens, understandably, where Rubens is mentioned, and in some cases, the engravers who are involved as well. So I would say among my records, at least, the trend, but that is also perhaps goes along with the trend of buying, let's say, groups of 25 to 50, at most 100 prints, to later on in the 17th century buying hundreds to 1,000 to 2,000 or 5,000 prints, as in some cases. Then you're not going to detail them all by name, but you're going to just list them as a bulk purchase.
Okay. Someone wants to know what percentage of prints were done in color, and was there any specific type of print done in color? And then do they hold up as well over time? They do not hold up as well over time, depending on how they're stored. I can answer that part of it.
I would say that there's clearly an increase in interest in coloring, in colored prints and prints in color. This is not printing with colored inks. This is coloring the images subsequently. Now, I did include a few examples of the print sales of colored images at the end of the 16th century, but by the 1620s to 30s, coloring has clearly become much more important. Mm-hmm. Now, as Alphonse Thijs also remarked, coloring was also a good impression of a print. So that if you are printing your copper plates to meet a huge demand and you're wearing them down such that you're just getting outlines and you're losing the fine detail, if you color it, the buyer is not going to see that loss of quality as easily. So that also goes hand in hand with the increase in production, is also perhaps an increase in coloring, which is kind of ironic because then the supplier gets to charge more for what is actually a poor quality impression to start with.
Right.
Right.
You mentioned with the Foster prints that he specified subjects that he didn't want, but otherwise, would you say they're generally of religious subjects?
When the subject is specified, well, I'm sorry. Let me think a moment. In the detailed order for Shelley, for example, in which we have lists of what Philip Scala and Adrian Collard and Theodor Scala all supplied, there are certainly among the works supplied by the Galas a number of non-religious prints, such as the one I showed from Court after Heemskerk. Adrian Collard's production then was more religious, so you will get both. When the print production was at this time in Antwerp, it's, as many people would remind you, the bed of the Counter-Reformation, reassertion of devotion, and the use of imagery in devotion. Now, my talk was based on Booksellers, but I could easily also have discussed images for the use of religious orders, whereby the Jesuits are very important buyers, but also the Capuchins, for example. So, and you even have monarchs, such as Albrecht and Isabella, also buying large quantities of religious images that they then distribute to specific orders or individuals or groups whom they wish to support. So the dominance of religious subject matter, I think, goes with the territory of Antwerp at the time of the early 17th century, but it is not exclusive. There are still other subjects being traded.
We have quite a number of questions, so we have to move along. Was there difficulty of trading cross-national borders? Were duties typically paid?
You would pay duties, tolls for shipping. Mm-hmm. So not tolls per se on individual prints, but if you were going between Antwerp and Frankfurt, for example, there are various places where you had the whole shipment was levied for tolls. Trade between the northern Netherlands and the southern Netherlands was complicated significantly by tolls, heavy tolls placed on transport on the River Scheldt, which resulted in the very odd situation that dealers in the northern Netherlands and the southern Netherlands often met at the Frankfurt fairs because that escaped or worked around the tolls. So you can get transport costs. I've also worked on that, where I can compare how much artists or buyers were charged for the shipment of goods and how that compares with the general rate charged by the shippers to transport goods between Antwerp and Frankfurt, for example. And you can obviously, as you would expect, the private individuals who are getting a little corner left in the barrel of books for their package of prints are paying a somewhat higher rate than Plantin or the Radices were paying for the bulk shipment.
Okay. Are there records of women involved in the trade or the print process that you've run across?
Yes, that's certainly. There are, in the letter from Forster that I showed, he refers to Constantia van Merlen, so that is a female who's running the shop. It was absolutely common in the time for women to either take over the book publishing or print publishing business. such as Mainken Liefrink. There'll be an article on her activities coming out in Simula soon. And another important factor that actually, to which Anthony Griffiths referred to last week, there are many instances where it's clear that the wives are handling the money. That, for example, the wives of Adrian Collard or Charles de Mallory are the ones who actually go to the Moretises and deliver prints, pick up money, and that sort of manner. So to what degree they actually were managing the books, I don't know. But in any case, they are clearly involved and participate in that. There was certainly a common factor or common aspect of the book and print business in the Low Countries, also in France, in the late 16th, 17th century and beyond.
Someone wants to know where these books that you've been using, the trade books that are located. They're in the Plantin Moretus Museum. Is that right?
That's right. So all the images that I've showed you are details from archival records in the Plantin Moretus Museum, and it's part of what makes this research project that I've been working on so fruitful. That I have access to daily account books that summarize purchases by client that were kept between, let's say, about 1560 into the 18th century. So you've got 100, I'm limited myself, not to 1560 to 1641, but I could continue. And there are certainly more print sales in the later 17th century that are all recorded in these account books. And that's what is a huge benefit when I do a price comparison, because I know I'm working with the constancy of the same record keeping, same record keepers, same business, and that makes comparisons a lot more meaningful and easier.
We just have so many more. We only have 6 minutes, but for artists like Rubens and Van Dyck, was the income generated by the sale of prints important or unimportant? Just probably not.
That's a very interesting question, and I'm afraid I don't have the resources to answer it, because I have no records of them delivering prints for sale personally. So I can't comment on whether they were making a profit on the resale of those prints. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
How did the volume of prints sold abroad compare with that in the local trade, would you say?
Also a great question. I think that in my records, for what the Moretises were doing, the volume of trade, export beyond, let's say, the local Low Countries is far greater. That's also logical, because if you're local, you can have much easier access to the print dealer and the print dealer to local distributors. So I wouldn't necessarily conclude that, for example, Charles de Mallory's prints were sought more actively in Cologne than in the Low Countries, but my records simply document huge quantities of his works going to Cologne, as well as some to Paris, also an understandable market. But I have no access to what he was trading himself locally, so I can't compare that.
Okay. Did you see an effect of the 30 Years' War at all?
Yes, that is clear, because that complicates significantly trade at the Frankfurt fairs. Mm-hmm. So you see that in the correspondence and in the records of the Plantin Moretus Press, where their transactions in Frankfurt clearly by the early 1620s really starts to peter off. And then there's this gap in the late 1620s, early 1630s, where the war is really complicating matters. And then they shift, as anyone would. You shift your trade routes and you work through other channels. But it was not simply the ease of people from very diverse parts of Europe congregating at the Frankfurt fairs was missing, obviously. So that did impact it.
Okay. Here's a question about, is there any evidence of whether they printed by need, or did they store up large numbers of prints and then, send them out from their stockpiles over the years, the way Rembrandt, from the watermark research of Hinterding, it was revealed that he printed in batches, and sometimes years later, after the print had been produced. So, the paper, you see that there's paper from 1630s, and then there's paper from 50s or something like
that. The best examples of that, I think, would be to look at inventories made, for example, of Volken Diericks, Hieronymus Koch's widow, who also, and other people were asking about examples of women working in the business. So she continued to sell Hieronymus Koch's prints decades after his death. Her inventory documents the number of independent sheets of images left in her stock. You'll see that with other inventories of print sellers. So that indicates, it will give you some idea that yes, they had prints on hand. We've also seen examples of that in inventories of print sellers in Italy as well. But I couldn't tell you exactly how much. I think you would think logically that you're going to have some on hand, but then you print for the large sales on demand.
Okay. I think we're going to have to go over, but people can feel free to obviously drop off when they need to. But if you don't mind, Karen, we'll continue a little bit after the hour. It's 12:59 Eastern now. It's not too late for you. There are such good questions here. What would be a good source for information on the export of prints to Latin America? That you know of one?
I'm afraid I don't. I'm afraid. I apologize for disappointing you again. I think that obviously you have visual comparisons which document the clear influence of prints on artworks produced in Latin America. But I am not familiar with archival sources for actual shipments and transport in Spain. You could, as many people have done, compare that, for example, with shipments of books from missionaries. So you could broaden your view and consider books as well as prints to get a general idea of what was done. But I'm afraid I don't have specific sources for Latin America.
So as people leave, make sure that you note that in the chat box, Samantha has put registration link for the next 2 lectures in this series. And then in a few weeks, this lecture will be up on the Center for History of Collecting website video channel. And she has also posted a link there, so stay tuned for that. Now, just a few more. Well, there's tons more. I don't really know how we cut them off. I feel bad. But let's see. Oh, someone answers that question saying Archivo de Indias and Biblioteca Nacional in Spain, maybe. And Aaron Hyman writing on prints after Rubens in Latin America. How about trade between printers and publishers in Antwerp? Antwerp's own booksellers? I guess that's a very complicated question, probably.
Well, once again, what's interesting is that you see, obviously, every bookseller would have a sort of, many would create their own niche of their sort of specialty. And you can also see that a bit reflected in the sorts of prints they also might offer for sale. For example, they would become specialized in the production of certain images that were then inserted in books, and then those images might be sold separately as independent print series. For, let's see, Hermanus Hugo Pia Desideria, which was very popular in London, for example. So we have examples of the Moretuses buying up sets of the illustrations that were originally made to go in books and then selling them to dealers in London. That's one example of interactions between local booksellers and dealers. The problem with doing local transactions is people are local, so they can stop by personally, and they're
Right.
not always recorded as extensively in these records. And I can't speak, obviously, if they did not involve the Moradises in their dealings. I can't speak personally on those. There is still, as I mentioned, research on Hieronymus Koch, as we all know, both major exhibition catalog and related articles, which also contain significant bibliography with references to, for example, Volksken Dierix's arrangement with another de Montpere for the sale of her prints. The Holstein catalogs also in their introductory essays for the Giotas, also for example, will talk about evidence of their own international transactions. So there is information to be found. Holstein entries, inventories such as the Duverger art inventories, which provide some inventories of artists, will also, for example, include references to foreign print or book dealers with whom those individuals traded. So it gives you an idea of at least some of their other clients without having the sales receipts.
Right. There's some very lively discussion about the print trade from Latin America. Lots of suggestions. Rosemary San Juan has published an excellent book called Vertiginous Mirrors. It's useful for resources. A more likely source are archives and ports from which materials were taxed before exports, such as Cadiz. Yeah, let's see what else. People have sort of wanted to know about, did they ever sneak in ceramics or other small items into the barrels, or also were these networks used for any other kind of artwork? It doesn't really sound like the latter, but perhaps the former, I don't know.
Well, actually, so for the curious, there are, obviously I focused on prints, obviously maps are also being traded. Paintings are also being shipped by the Moradises to individuals. Pearls are being shipped via the Moradises. They're hidden in clothes for the people working at the Frankfurt Fair. So you have, obviously, when you go to the Frankfurt Fair, you stay there for a couple of weeks and you need clothes. So in addition to books, clothes were sent. And occasionally, hidden in some of the clothes are pearls or boxes for pearls or other objects. So that does occur. The Frankfurt Fairs were not just books or prints, they were all sorts of specialty objects, and occasionally the Moradises would bring back some toys for their children, special
17th century.
Oh yes, toys from the spring fair, and other special items requested by an aunt or by someone else. So it makes for very interesting reading and is a little more varied than what I've presented, although I don't want to get someone's hopes up too high, and I will be realistic. It is primarily books and then prints.
And then,
so I'm sorry. I should also mention food was sent.
Oh.
Cheese was sent.
Oh.
Bread. There's apparently a very popular sugar bread from Antwerp that they regularly sent to various individuals via the Frankfurt Fairs. So it is diverse.
I think this is going to be the last question. Difference in price range depending on the type of use, so suffragette versus regular devotional, but also sort of premium on color. Is there a big? Could you tell the premium on color prints versus parchment? Just can you talk a tiny bit more about prices, how they might have set the prices? And just personally, I found it so fascinating the way the press realized in the course of not that many years, I guess about 15, the great value they were getting out of this from 1608 to 1623 and how they could raise the prices.
Well, so prices were set in the first place by the supplier, by the print publisher. And one very clear result of this research is that different individuals could ask different prices. So Charles de Malory routinely asked more for his prints than the basic prints supplied by Theodor Gall or Adrian Collard.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in addition to that base level, and Hieronymus Wierix's prints were also more expensive than Charles de Malory. That's a very general scale that I can give you. Another factor going into the pricing of prints would also be size. So once you could use that scale for prints that are all essentially the same size. If you get much larger images, those are indeed going to be more expensive. But it's not always a very strict relationship by size. Also, the person involved is an important factor. In terms of shift from paper to parchment or plain versus colored, those also obviously change the value. Coloring was really and gilding obviously significantly increased the cost of the print. But again, it remains a very bizarre, imprecise thing as to whether the Moretises asked for a greater profit margin depending on the type of print or the supplier or the client. And I'm inclined to believe that they generally base their profit margin, a sort of rounding up of the price, based on the client. And they overcharge some people more than others.
Okay, I do think we have to go. In general, people are very pleased with the lecture. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. It's incredible research. As I said, this lecture will be available on the Frick's website in just a week or so, so you can watch it again there. Thank you so much, Karen. This was just absolutely fabulous. Really appreciated it.
My pleasure.